So thank you very much, and for inviting me to do this. Also, slightly kind of curses because trying to summarize everything that's happened today is pretty much impossible, and then also having to follow Boris, Rastko, Tarek, and Simon, and then try and close things up. I don't know.
You don't have to close things up.
No, I won't. No, I'm opening things up. That's the spirit of kind of democracy, right? So I'm going to try and touch upon as many different bits that were raised in various contributions throughout today through talking about three different issues. First of all, very briefly, language, then moving on to community, and then on to fascism, which I know we've already talked about quite a lot today, but I think it's important to go back to that once more before we finish and go to the bar. So language, there was something Bernadette said earlier on about the link between language and reality as being something of crucial importance. I think the task of this public editorial meeting is intrinsically about language. You know, even the quotation marks around these words, people and we, everything suggests that there's a kind of level of signifiers, and there's a politics underneath it that we're trying to get to. And we've had all of these different words: masses, mobs, peoples, aggregates, the people, we, publics, public. And we've had some really nice little nifty sort of pithy definitions. We is a mode of power. We is not a static entity, but a space of constant improvisation. A public is an imaginary community. A people is a non-political body that's constituted by politics. I quite like all of these, so I thought it was worth reiterating. And Dave Beach, I don't know if Dave's still here, but earlier on he made the point that all of these are different. All of these are very differently formulated. All of these have their nuances. And I totally agree. But what I think is really crucial is that we see them all in their interrelationships. We see how a people responds to a public, relates to a public, how a public relates to a mass and a mob. We don't see them as isolated. And that extends to the discourses that surround each of these words. We have to see all of these discourses together in concert, because that's where the politics lies. Otherwise, we're just ignoring this whole wealth of material that we can work from. So, the reason I make this kind of warning is that I worry, especially in the art world, where we have this obsession with novelty and innovation and being one step ahead of the curve always, is that one minute we're talking about the commons, and then suddenly the commons is old-fashioned and old hat, and we don't want to talk about the commons anymore. Let's talk about publics. And then that's old hat. Let's talk about the people. And I'm worried that we keep running away from answerability in terms of the language that we use. And so this is why I'm making this kind of call that, no, we should really think about these words together as a kind of continuity rather than each as their own separate thing. So I'm going to focus on the word community as maybe a word that has been kind of become unfashionable, has maybe been slightly forgotten, but is absolutely intrinsic to these debates around the idea of the people, of the public. And one figure who was mentioned a couple of times by Irit and I think Bernadette was Jean-Luc Nancy. And this book being Singular Plural, which he wrote in 1996, I think. So 13 years prior to that, he wrote a book called The Inoperative Community, which was an incredibly influential rethinking of community. And then he ditched the word community. He stopped using it, and he started using terms like being with or being in common as placeholders for the idea of community. And in Being Singular Plural, he's doing that. About 5 years after he wrote that book, he wrote another essay, a short essay called The Confronted Community. And he says in it, I consciously stopped using this word because I felt that community as a word had been compromised. And I felt it was no longer retrievable. So I stopped using it. I used all these other terms. And I was totally wrong to do that. And I'm really sorry that I didn't talk about community at the heart of that book, because I shouldn't have relinquished this language. So I think that's a really important thing. So, community. how can we relinquish this idea of community, and how do we see it relating to the question of the people and the we and the public? Well, I think if we follow the path of Nancy's own writing on community, we end up going back to Georges Bataille, who was, as well, also for people like Blanchot and Agamben and all these other 80s and 90s theorists of community, Bataille was this sort of godfather figure. And his work, I think, in the context of today, is incredibly useful and interesting, particularly in the context of the discussion of fascism. He wrote a sort of short manifesto for community in 1936 called the Programme Relative to Assefaal. And one of the points on this manifesto says, fight for the decomposition and exclusion of all communities, national, socialist, communist or churchly, other than universal community. So here, I think it came up earlier, the fact that sort of nationalism, fascism, communism, socialism were all sort of tarred with the same brush in Boris and Rasko's talk earlier. Well, I think he's doing the same thing, but he's doing it against a very specific historical context. The particular manifestations of communism and socialism, as well as fascism, nationalism, and religion that Bataille was witnessing in the mid-30s, these were all participating in a total manipulation and mobilization of the idea of community. And I think we could also say of the people. And the reason I say because of a people is there's this term which I don't know has actually come up this weekend, but the idea of the Volksgemeinschaft. This having been the primary source of legitimacy underpinning the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1930s, a community of the people. And this, this was in order to provide legitimacy for the Nazi Party, as again was kind of pointed towards earlier. A community of the people was needed had to be designated and then mobilized in order that the party wouldn't collapse. And talking about Hungary earlier on, and the fact that maybe the problem with Hungarian fascism, or I mean the problem from the perspective of Hungarian fascists, is that there is not yet a community of the people behind them. So yes, the reason why I want to talk about community, and I think it's incredibly important, is that the lesson that we can take from Bataille and from Nancy is that perhaps the most important thing is to challenge other people's conceptions of the people and the community, other people's conceptions of the people. I don't know. There's so many like tautological, circuitous phrases that have come out this weekend of like, we think that we is this or whatever. Anyway, yes. The Varoufakis, the quotation that Boris mentioned earlier, from this thing that was in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago from his talk in Zagreb. Not that I necessarily side with Varoufakis on everything, but this idea that in times of crisis, it's not the left who tends to be prepared for some kind of mobilization. It tends to be the right, I think is incredibly persuasive and I think it's something that we should take to heart on the left. And that's why I think that this idea of checking other people's constructions of the we is a more urgent, more necessary political task in our current environment. And that's why I raised the question of community and Bataille, because I think this was something that was going on at that point in a certain literature, in a certain discourse. So, I've totally gone off track and ad-libbed, so I have no idea where I'm at now in my notes. So, I'm going to say, oh yeah, so the other case study that came up, again, more recent sort of mobilization of a community that maybe points to a kind of contemporary relevance of this discussion is the case of Charlie Hebdo. And this idea of the, je suis Charlie, which is the most perfect identity-driven community. I am the other. This is like totally textbook. And as was pointed out, it's this I, not we. So perhaps if we go, carry on back into the history of community theory again, we're not talking about a community, we're talking about what followed community in the work of Ferdinand Tönnies, a German sociologist in the late 19th century, who talks about Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, community and society, or something like that. In community, there is a we. In society or Gesellschaft, there is only ever the I. And you form alliances and you form temporary coalitions, but you only ever do so for the benefit of the I. Therefore, everything comes down to the I. The I is the basic unit of all groupings. And I think that's the shift that goes from the nous sommes to the je suis. That's what we see. It's a kind of Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft shift. Linking that to Tariq's talk, what I think is interesting about this new form of community is, again, it's mobilizations. Who is mobilizing it and in what direction? And every time I say community, I kind of mean people, even though I have already said that these words will mean different things. In what direction and who is mobilizing these? Well, certainly it's played into the hands of an emergent fascism in Europe. And this, of course, is of huge concern and something that we should absolutely be paying attention to. But at the same time, it's been fairly actively, fairly empirically mobilized by the extreme center that Tariq talks about. You know, the bailout of Charlie Hebdo by the French state is a laying claim to a people who had perhaps to some extent kind of self-identified through Twitter as, you know, the Je suis Charlie community. But any sense of autonomy of that group was immediately shattered by the fact that, you know, I can't remember how much the French state paid to Charlie Hebdo now, something like $1.2 million or euros or whatever. That was an immediate laying claim to that people and an attempt to use that people in mobilization to the ends of the extreme center. So we have two, while it is great to think about constructions of the we from our own political position and what our own benefit of what benefit we might derive from particular constructions of the we, I think that we have, from both the extreme center and the extreme right, far more dangerous, far more urgent, far more violent constructions of the we that we need to really deconstruct before, and I don't mean that with all the theoretical baggage, it's just literally the putting D in front of constructions. Deconstruct, maybe I do, I'm not sure. We need to deconstruct those before we can start thinking seriously about our own constructions. That's my gist. I don't know if there was a final point that I wanted to end on, anything nice and pithy. I'm not sure there is. I tried to rattle through that really quickly. Yeah, that'll do. We'll pass over now to Andrea.
Great, thank you. Okay, it's an unenviable task, but I do like an art historian who doesn't mention art once.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So I'm going to mention it. Okay, so this is now, it's all been a public editorial meeting, but this is the point at which we begin to edit, okay? So we now need to go through the past 2 days, and we need to, as a collective enterprise, think about what's important, what we want to retain, what we want to advise Former West on taking forward. And we need to remember, I mean, I'm sure there are many people in this room who have been in editorial meetings, endless editorial meetings, whereby it's a messy business, but some things need to be taken out of the picture. Okay? Now, one of the things that you took out of the picture was art, so I'm going to put it back in there. We are, well, I don't want to generalize, but I presume that the majority of the people in here are participate in some form of cultural work. Okay, cultural work has been positioned in various ways over the past 2 days. Most notably, in my mind, and sadly he's wiped it off our drawing board, the Rastos in the Freudian analytical framework as a kind of solution, a solution through estrangement of a certain pathologization of, or a certain embodiment of fascism. Okay, it's also been talked about in all sorts of different ways. But it seems to me that we can't allow art to be that productive, because we know as a group of people that it often isn't. It often plays for the other side, effectively. So what are the moments, as a group of majoritively cultural workers, what are the things we want to take away from these these discussions, in order to think about the reorganization and the rearticulation of our practices, both individual and collective? We don't work together all the time. We very rarely work together. And of course, we saw that in Nina Power's frustration this morning, which she embodied fantastically well, and we should remember that. So what are the things that have been discussed, taking up these responses that Harry has given us? But what are the things we want to take away, and we want to ask Former West to continue to develop in relationship to the questions that have arisen and the ideas that have arisen over the past couple of days? So now the floor is yours, and we've got 2 microphones, I think. We've got one, we had one, maybe we can have one on this side and one on this side. And I'm going to try and kind of make some connections between the things that are suggested. It might be that there are things that you think we haven't spoken about that have been very frustrating to you. It might be that there are projects you think we need to look at. So just let's begin to wrap things up. So first hand over here. Takes a bit of time, I think. Yeah. So let's see. So while we're waiting for this one, are there other people? Right, okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks. Is that working? Yes. Yeah, okay.
Tell us who you are.
I'm Natalie. I'm on the MFA curating course, one of Simon's students. So one thing that I found somewhat frustrating, and it was only briefly touched on, I think, in Jana's talk, and Bernadette spoke about it with the work that was going on with the Art Acre Prize, is that we're talking about constructing a we, and we're talking from the point of view of art, but we talk very little about changing who that we is and about who's making the work. Mm-hmm. And I think that seemed really important when we have, as institutions, we allow only certain voices onto those platforms. And surely, in order to construct the we has to be doing something, and to broaden who is included in the construction of the people, then, making divisions over whose work constitutes art, if art is going to have any kind of power, and it seems very critical that something does, then that's something that I felt frustrating that wasn't really addressed, or maybe people aren't thinking about and should be.
Yeah, good. Okay. Yes, here. Wait for it. So let's just, pile in. Next person here. Thank you.
I'm Zion from Visual Culture Department, and I'm interested in the idea that lately and today elaborated, which touched upon the idea of separatism as kind of a way of departure, and I wonder how the we is informed in this separationism, and how do you think it could possibly be that in this structure the relations of art and the community could be? Because I feel like we hardly talk about the conception of this separationism, although we have some elaboration in terms of the referendum and some other points. Thanks.
Sorry, keep the mic. What do you mean by separationism? Was there a particular talk that you were thinking about?
Yeah, Tariq also touched upon this idea that in different geographies, they have some minor movement, say, for example, would it be possible to break America to 3 parts? That's, I think, one of them. And Scotland as one of the independent projects,
okay.
Let's say.
Yeah. Okay. So movements of independence and the formation of solidarities. Okay. Right. Jean?
one of the things that I would retain.
Speak into the microphone,
One
please.
of the things that I would retain from the day, or from the 2 days, is Rasko's separation of the self through the Freudian tradition, the self and the subject, and thinking the subject as a divided unconscious subject. And then this the way he developed the transference in relation to group psychology and this kind of love that is linked with fascism, and thinking about art as possibly a way in which there could be where that could be broken up, and the division of the subject could be somehow be brought into play. And that makes me think of the Lacanian tradition, which is a very Bataillean tradition, which takes up, unworks the restricted economy, this idea that you do something in order to get a return. But this notion of well, it's a different economy, what he called the general economy. But I want to take up the Lacanian position, which is this idea that what breaks in the clinical situation, what breaks the transference, love, which services fascism, is the incarnation of a singular object of jouissance or desire. And Lacan makes the argument that fascism comes into being because that object, or that is relegated to waste on the limits of the ideals. And finally it produces a kind of incarnation. And art is one way, through sublimation, of actually bringing that into the field of the ideal or the imaginary of love, transference, and so on. So I would want to make an argument for the fact that there are works of art that are within the economy and service of goods, that are packaged for purchase and pleasure, even very transgressive works, which I think are conservative, but I think there are works of art that are indexed to this extreme limit of the division in the subject, which could be thought to be a sublimation, that I think are doing something else.
Okay. So
just to take further
yeah.
Rasko's point.
No, this is very good. I want to ask you if you wanted to respond from a Bataillean perspective, but just to say that I think it's important that we begin to make these distinctions between types,
And
methodologies and
subjects.
types of artistic production. Yeah, I think this is really important. Not all art creates the divisions and and not all art is able to produce these forms of estrangement that are so important to this process. Estrangement is one word for it. Yeah. Okay. So, any response?
I'm not sure about offering anything specifically Bataille on it. I think what you're saying is right, and like you say, we should be distinguishing. And I think it came up earlier, talking about art as just art in its generality is kind of useless.
It's like talking about the people.
Yes.
Yeah.
So.
Add one thing to that.
wait, Jean.
But there's I've forgotten what the name of the essay is. There's a great essay by Paul Mattick, one of the Paul Matticks, I can't remember which one now, that talks about the fact that art's value comes from its, and this is harking back to something else that was said earlier. Art's value comes from its non-economic character, and I think that's where the potential that things that we're talking about here might actually have some kind of broader benefit, without seeing it as being some kind of pure, like art as offering some space of pure criticality. Is that actually, in a way, we're allowed to do this here because presumably it's offering some kind of value for someone outside at some point. Otherwise Form West wouldn't be funded, right? I don't know. But
It's got a lot of cultural capital.
It's got a lot of cultural capital, and hey. And I'm going to speak for Nina because she's gone. When she was in a better mood, she said to me, like, oh, it's great. These art events are the places where I can actually come along and say this stuff, because when I do things in my own kind of politics, philosophy fields, I have to abide by the rules, and I have to say, like, I have to just follow my line. So, but she saw this as a very positive thing. Just because she was in a bad mood, she said it was terrible today, but I think that fact that she, in a better mood, saw art as being as a site for things that aren't allowed in other places maybe hints at how art can be seen. But that question back there about who is constructing the way in art is really important. Okay. But I'll leave that for someone else to pick up.
Okay. Yes, hold on. Wait. Microphone.
You mean art or institution?
Is that question for Harry?
I I suppose I'm referring more to the institutions of art, yeah. But that's because I'm thinking about the kind of the economic value of art and, you know, what art is permitted to do, and therefore that's an institutional question.
No, sorry. So I'm sorry, I've got to get more voice in. Richard. And then
I'd like to read a bit more, maybe in the future, about a sort of paradox that Simon identified in his talk at the beginning, about how institutions, on the one hand, need audiences. They can't survive without audiences, but at the same time, produce audiences in a certain sort of way. And I didn't really understand it, but it seemed an interesting idea. I'd like to get a more of a sense of how galleries, for instance, art galleries produce audiences, what sort of agency that actually entails, and what kinds of responsibilities they might have, in terms of exercising that agency. I think I'm quite skeptical about this claim, but it's an interesting one. And then I think that a lot of what I've heard here around the notion of the public sounds good, but seems quite ephemeral to me. I can't quite grasp it or something, but it seems to me that this is a concrete enough way of approaching how publics with some sense of political identification might form around art institutions. So I'd like a bit more on that, if it's possible.
Yeah, well, Dave Beach talked about this morning and gave a series of historically organised formulations of the public, and one of the ideas that has been hovering around, I feel, is precisely this, which is how do the institutions of art, which is different, by which I mean art institutions rather than the institution of art. How do art institutions become places that can be sites of political gathering or mobilization? There have been many versions of that today. And in a way, when we started off yesterday morning with a very precise focus on, well, not particularly precise, but a focus on Innova, this is one of the questions. How can these organizations be transformed into something that is a site of political organization? So I think this is good, and we should pursue this one further. There was a question up here, yeah, or a thought.
Hi, I was also interested, as we were talking, there was a lot of reference to the welfare state, and it was very kind of European focused, and the shift from the welfare state and funding towards the arts and health and education, and how the shift has become to privatization and late capitalism. I'm interested to maybe discuss more about countries that never had the welfare state, and that shift. There was never like this kind of romantic ideal of looking back to this time where things were great. So yeah, I think that would be something quite interesting to discuss further.
Okay, that's very interesting. Also in relationship to Mao and Tariq's argument about the prefigurative basis of politics coming into being in places where there has previously not been the state formation that is presumed by the welfare state. Yeah, so I think that will be interesting to link those two arguments together. I just wanted to bring into the tape, I can see as the microphone is coming towards you, and since I've just referenced Mao, I think also it's important to remember the moments across the 2 days where the idea of indigeneity and its different methodologies of producing not only what might be understood as a kind of creative acts, but also politics. And various exhibitions have been mentioned, but also to think about indigeneity as another way into these arguments, because it's been something we haven't really tackled. So I think that's important. Anyway, here, next person.
Yes, I would like to suggest that one takes into account the notion of the we, and try to understand what this we are and what is after, what is for, and why a we. I mean, is this meant to be a political subject that is to be created? or is it something else? And also, perhaps that, with regards to Nancy, also to remember, the question he poses about democracy. What is democracy? The opening question is, or the line that is that he refers to as floating around, stating that everything is political. So is everything political, in this sense? And also, why should art and its institution be the space, the place, the formative, function for the production of these we's? I don't know why, and why is this now occurring in art? A bit of self-reflection, I think, might.
Yeah, I think we've been self-reflecting a lot. I think what we've just been doing what you've just asked us to do for the past 2 days, and I want to refer to Bernadette Buckley, who had a perfect answer to this. Is everything political? What is the politics and what is art? Bernadette, what was your response? It was something about. It was a double negative on both accounts. Not art, not politics. Yeah. That's a classic get-out clause, it would seem to me.
Can I just say,
Yes.
as an add-on to that question, there was a book that came out, and I can't remember who wrote it, a couple of years ago, called All Art is Political Art, and it was someone in Scotland. And
Who said it was such surprise?
but the main problem with that is that it's an excuse to not be political in art, because you say, no, it's fine, we're already political.
Yeah.
Like, it's by its very nature political, and therefore it's a sort of abdication of responsibility from art, that idea that everything is political, even though it may be true.
Yeah, it's kind of privatisation. Yeah, absolutely, I agree. Other thoughts? Down here. Down there. So 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. My name is Justin O'Shaughnessy. We talked a bit about how the legal and law and how it attempts to formulate the public, but I'm kind of questioning in a way whether it also eviscerates it as well and removes any possibility for collective action, whether you look from anything from the 1870s Fairs Act through 20th century licensing to the 1994 Criminal Justice Act and Public Order Act. So that, and whether both law and, I suppose, capitalism desires, in terms of the collective, what they really want is a collective amnesia. They want people to forget that they have rights, forget maybe that they've bought something before so that they can buy it again. So when I first bought, my first bit of vinyl, then I had to buy it again on iTunes. Actually, I already owned it, so why did I have to buy it again? But if I downloaded it illegally, it would have been illegal. So I suppose one of my questions is that kind of sense of collective action. I wonder, we briefly, I think Nina mentioned the 2011 riots, and I think they're an extraordinary example of how the collective has been so eviscerated and diminished, and those riots weren't Occupy, they weren't poll tax riots, they weren't the peasants' revolts, they were what you were talking about, the I and the we with the German terms. I won't try and state. So I suppose my question is whether art has a role in being part of the collective memory that therefore allows people to remember action is possible.
Okay, thank you. Before we go on to the next question, I'm just going to invoke Boris Boudin, who yesterday put an injunction on archives. Boris, do you have a response to that? No, he doesn't. But there's but we have to remember that but Boris very dramatically put an injunction on archives yesterday.
Do we destroy the archive, or is that where the agency still sits? Because if we destroy it, we lose that collective memory.
Or along with all those artists that work in archives. But we'll leave that one in the air, okay? And we're going over here. Sorry, but here there was also Simon. Did you want one? There's somebody here, but here first. Yeah, great.
Okay.
I don't know.
Now?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I'm really interested in politics,
Can you say who you are?
Oh.
I know who you are.
I'm
but nobody
Joanna.
else.
Yeah, I'm Joanna. I'm a PhD researcher, art department. I'm really interested in construction of the we in terms of the we produced by public art and politics of this production and how the public projects can be constructed and commissioned in the British context. And I think that we should talk, and it's really essential, about health and safety, which limit the possibilities and the potential of public art in Britain, especially in this culture. Dave Beach, which I had conversation between the session, told me never introduce yourself as a public artist or artist that does public art. Just say I'm an artist who works in public realm, and I think this is very significant. This kind of secondary role of public art that I'm convinced that is able to produce really effective politically, socially, however contingent and ephemeral, but it's it's the nature of now.
Thank you, Joanna. Simon. Dave also talked about this, of course, in his talk this morning as well. I'm just going.
No, I thought I'd just briefly, answer some of these questions on behalf of the project. So, it was kind of there is a certain trajectory, of course, in former West, and part of it is to say that there is a change in conceptions that affect, of course, society and therefore art and politics equally. Mm. That we claim there is a shift that happens with 1989, and we try to construct this proposition that you can say there is a former West, which is not the past. And this is also why I think I discussed this with Boris yesterday, saying it's not a question necessarily of banishing the archive, but it is to say, don't look for emancipation in the past. Mm. Okay, it's not located in the past. Utopia is not in the past, even though this seems to be a big move at the moment in terms of memory culture, and this is something
and has been referred to consistently over the past 2 days,
and something that we will actually discuss in the next public editorial meeting. So we'll go more into depth with it there if you can come to Budapest. And then the other thing is, of course, that the notion of people, I think, has also changed, and the way that it's a metaphor in political space. So it was to put it a little bit as a question mark, also in terms of cultural production. Yeah. And this is why, of course, I was polemicizing against Rachel's short voyage to the land of the people, because I think that we know through cultural production that it's sometimes I say it's a very long walk to the land of the people. Mm. It's often very difficult. And I think these 2 days have talked about that difficulty. I agree. Yeah. So then maybe more to Richard's point, I think this is the Michael Warner's idea of this double feature of the publics. He calls it chicken and egg circularity. So cultural production exists for a public, but that public doesn't exist unless the cultural production addresses them. So this is a strange kind of, and then the question becomes, if we know historically what the role of the art institution was, let's say Tony Bennett, etc., it's the kind of stuff I force my students to read. Yeah. This is the birth of the museum, is the birth of the, it has to do to implement the nation, it has to implement the bourgeois, the proper subjects, etc. What are the ways in which we use the institution as a mode of address, and can the institution, the way that is historically constructed, create other modes of address that then creates other subjects? Mm. So this is kind of what we tried to do, maybe didn't achieve.
No, I think this is very strong throughout the 2 days. But then the next question on top of that is not just in what ways does the institution propose a mode of address, but then in what ways does the institution on a pragmatic and conceptual level need to be changed in order to do that in a different way. So that's the next step. One more question up here, and then I'm going to ask. Well, we've one more, and then I'm going to ask. Sorry, because I'm being flashed at with time signals. So I just want to ask Maria finally if you want to say anything. So 1, 2, Maria 3. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, that goes very much in the direction what Simon said now, because in these 2 days it was so much said about what the institution does. But I want to remind that for me, an art institution is a place or a space of negotiation between artists, curators, directors, administration, staff, etc., and in a sort of negotiation, as conflict, as a constant conflict about that space, about discourse, about meaning, about money, about whatever. So I think, to change the institution is also a part of the artist, is also part of the audience, is also part of who. So I think this is very important to keep in mind, that there is not only a demand what the institution should do, because there is no ideal or perfect institution. The institution is that what the people sharing it are making out of it. That, for me, very important as a point.
Yeah, ideally. Yeah, that's just supplemental.
Hi, I really hate talking in public, so this is probably not going to come out properly, but I think kind of what I've been thinking about while all these things have been coming up, and this idea of like the role that the institution plays and how we can change it, and this idea of like also like what was talked about yesterday about meritocracy and like what is merit within this. I think like what we're really forgetting, and this idea of like broadening what the art institution includes, is that actually like there are communities of artists that exist like outside of the institution, and like, you know, they don't need to be spoken for by this institution, and maybe like the politics actually like lies out, like, and we and I mean we in like an institutional way will never be able to address that. So it's not like the institution that needs to change in itself, it's maybe like just a realization that it can act for something else, and you know the politics are there, they are somewhere else, there is this thing that's existing, but maybe we as the institution will never recognize it.
Yeah. Thank you. Maria, you wait for a microphone. No, you've got one. Thank you.
It's of course impossible to offer some
Maria, can you speak into the microphone?
I do.
Oh, it's not on.
So I speak to the microphone, but it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Of course, it's impossible to offer any sort of conclusion remark. To me, these have been 2 remarkable days with enormous amount of propositions, and I'm quite amazed how prominent, for example, the notion of an institution has become also in these rounds. And it took me by surprise, I have to say. Now, I am a director of one institution, and when there is a talk about the institution, I have constantly feeling we talk about the Tate Modern, something that you introduced in the beginning, because there are so many examples of other institutions that do the work we desire, that imagine communities and try to enact possibilities we desire. There's plenty of examples to my knowledge, and it might sound like an exaggeration. But I think these things are possible. I think we need to get rid of that feeling that there is only one option possible, and look around and seek for those pockets of possibility that are already there. And I think in my introductory notes, I was trying to say precisely this. I think this is to some extent daily reality. And that we need to, rather than speaking about art in institutions, about the manywhere of artistic practices. And that's not against big institutions, not against the museums, art galleries, art fairs, biennials, but in spite of them. So the practices that interest me now are those that operate transversely between these different worlds. And in a way enact another possibility to a great extent. So in this sense, I am an optimist.
Yeah.
And I've learned a lot. You know, in my opening notes, I was trying to say, you know, that variety of art, that art undercurrent within what we call contemporary art, that does something else than what we think contemporary art does. So it's also my, clumsy English, of course. And then Bernadette comes with something not art, not politics. I was like, that's it. So there were huge numbers of propositions that were really extremely inspiring and really important for me. I, however, see precisely what Harry brought up. Language is a big issue. And I think a vocabulary of the past will not help us to get beyond this current moment. We kind of need to invent ways of speaking. So what do you say when you say art? What do you say when you say people and we? And that's precisely the reason why we brought up these terms to the center of this discussion, to try to figure out how do we ourselves move beyond that confusion that keeps us at the place where we are at this very moment. Once again, I think there have been a number of propositions. I think that shift from mere critique to proposition has taken place. And I can invite everybody to come with all these thoughts to follow us to other public editorial meetings, such as the one in Budapest in May, titled "There is a Crack in the Museum of History." Which is again proposition. There is a crack. We believe it's possible to identify and invest the imagination of art to imagine that other possibility and to enact the world otherwise, to enact another world. And I think this is what we can do if we, create for ourselves the moment where the we can come to life and do what we, enact the world we really want. And on this optimistic note, I just want to thank all of you. It's been remarkable 2 days, I think. Thank you, all the contributors, again, all of you. And my partners in this enterprise, Simon mainly, Andrea, Mal, Boris, and once again, all of you. Thank you so very much.
And can we just thank Maria for bringing everything to us? So now, for the next 2 or 3 weeks, every time we say we're going to qualify it. Okay? Thank you very much. Drinks outside.